All right, guys, welcome back. Always excited to share with you. So let's get into this. All right, so we're talking about Jesus healing a widow's son. And this is from Luke chapter 7, verses 11 through 17. All right, or I should say, Jesus raising a widow's son from the dead. Much different than healing a widow's son, right? So this is what it is. It's, like I said, Luke 7, 11 to 17. Soon afterward, Jesus went with his disciples to the village of Nain, and a large crowd followed him. A funeral procession was coming out as he approached the village gate. The young man who had died was a widow's only son, and a large crowd from the village was with her. When the Lord saw her, his heart overflowed with compassion. "Don't cry," he said. Then he walked over to the coffin and touched it, and the bearer stopped. "Young man," he said, "I tell you, get up." Then the dead boy sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. Great fear swept the crowd, and they praised God, saying, "A mighty prophet has risen among us, and God has visited his people today." And the news about Jesus spread throughout Judea and the surrounding countryside. This is an interesting story for a lot of reasons. One, it's only found in Luke. So none of the other Gospels tell this story, and it happens in a town called Nain, which this is the only place in the entire Bible that this town is talked about. And the town of Nain is just a town in Israel. It's still there today, actually. It's spelled differently than it is in the Bible today, but it still has the same name. It's a little bit south, a little bit east of Nazareth. So this place would have been close to where Jesus was born. Or Jesus lived, I should say, where Jesus lived. Got to get my story right, don't I? Anyway, so he would have been maybe familiar with it, would have maybe walked by it. I don't know. He probably didn't get there too often, but he still would have been familiar with it. So this passage says that he's walking into the gates. He's walking into the city. You know, many cities in Jesus times, in Bible times, had actual walls that went around the city to protect them from invaders. Historians believe that this town didn't have walls, but that this is probably talking just about the road that comes into town. All right, and so that would have been kind of the gate, kind of the entrance into the town, if you will. So Jesus, and this large crowd is following him, and I for whatever reason, I get this picture of Forrest Gump in my head. If you've seen the movie Forrest Gump, I know this is not accurate, but if you've seen the movie, the scenes where he just decides he's going to run, and he runs, and eventually word gets around that he's doing this, he's just running, nobody understands why. But then people start running with him, they start following, and then as he kind of makes his way across the country, the crowds keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and they follow him wherever he goes. That's just this picture that I get in my head. Not that Jesus looked like Forrest Gump, because probably not, but maybe that's a different message for a different day. Anyway, he's coming into town, right? And he sees this funeral procession coming out. So they've had the funeral already. They've gone through the grieving process. They've started that. They've accepted the fact that this son is gone. So they're coming out of town, most likely to the cemetery to bury him, because the cemetery would have been outside of the town. They wouldn't have wanted it inside. They would have come out of town to bury this boy. Doesn't say how old, but it just says a young man. So, maybe 20s or so. I don't know. Nobody knows that. But it says the young man who had died was a widow's only son. And then it goes on to say, when the Lord saw her, his heart overflowed with compassion. There's a lot that goes into that. First, during Bible times, during New Testament times, if you were a widow, so if you were a woman whose husband had died, you were already kind of looked at as an outcast. You weren't looked on in a very good way. And so, this woman already had that going against her. Oftentimes the man was the one who provided the income through farming, through whatever work they could find. And so when this woman lost her husband, that kind of just set her back a little bit. But then, thankfully, she had the son. She had a son who could help her, who could take over some of those jobs and those duties to help provide an income for the family. And then all of a sudden, he dies. He passes away. So now this woman is nothing. The chances are that she would have been an outcast, that she would have really struggled to make a living, struggled to find work, and not had very many friends, because widows were just, for whatever reason, they were just looked at as outcasts, as outsiders. So, and of course, Jesus knew this when he walked up to the gate and he saw the funeral coming out. Being God, he knew who she was. He knew the circumstances. He understood all that. That's why it says Jesus, his heart overflowed with compassion. I absolutely love the language that is used there. Overflowed with compassion. His heart overflowed with compassion. When we talk about our heart, oftentimes we talk about our feelings, we talk about our emotions, we talk about how we express ourselves. You've heard the expression, wear your heart on your sleeve. Just basically you're living your life in a way that you just kind of let people know how you're feeling. So when it says that his heart overflowed with compassion, it's very clear and evident here that Jesus was concerned. He was compassionate. He was he felt sorry in a way for this woman. He knew what she was going to be going through. He understood all that. Of course, he didn't like it, but he understood it, and so he wanted to do something about it. And the first point that I want to emphasize here is that Jesus is compassionate. If you are going through a hard time, he's compassionate about that. He understands it. He doesn't like it when we go through tough times. That doesn't mean that he's not going to let them happen to us, because they help us grow closer to God. But Jesus is very compassionate. His heart overflowed with it. And he didn't want this woman to be upset. He didn't want her to be forced to live a life of being an outsider. So then he goes on to say, don't cry. Just, hey, don't cry. And I can imagine this woman's bawling. Her life is completely changed. From the moment her son passed away, very, very different. That her outlook on life has gone way downhill. So he comes up to her and says, don't cry. Kind of like a dad talking to his kids, when they're going through a tough time, when they're they struggle in school, or they broke up with a boyfriend or a girlfriend, that kind of way. Don't cry. Don't cry. It's okay. Don't cry. Then he walked over to the coffin and touched it, and the bearers stopped. So they knew something was coming. They knew something was going on. And then he says, "Young man, I tell you, get up." And then, just like with many of his other miracles we've talked about, the boy gets up. The dead boy sat up and began to talk. So not only did this boy sit up and was alive again, he was talking. He was just, I would have loved to have heard what he said. Then Jesus gave him back to his mother. The next point that I want to talk about is this. It says, great fear swept the crowd. Oftentimes, when we experience Jesus, when we encounter something that comes from God, there can be a lot of fear that comes from it. And especially during this time, because this was all new. This was all completely new. And so I was just curious as to kind of what the original language had said. So I did a little digging, a little research into the original Greek. So this is what I found. So the word that is used here is actually, it's going to sound familiar to you. It's called phobos. Phobos, P-H-O-B-O-S, if you were to write it in English. All right. And so this word can be defined as panic, flight, fear, the causing of fear, terror. There's a few times that it's used in the Bible. It's also, I'll get into what those are, but it also, can we talk about it? Intimidation, reverence, fear, fearful, fears. But the main usage, the usage in which it's used in our passage here is about fear, being afraid. Phobos. And so other examples of places it's used in the Bible, Matthew 14:26, they cried out for fear, and fear they cried out. Matthew 28:4, they shook for fear of him and shook for fear of him. So it's used throughout the Bible, but the idea here is that they were afraid. Phobos may sound familiar because we have phobias now. Well, there's all different kinds of phobias, things that we're afraid of. Arachnophobia, afraid of spiders. Claustrophobia, afraid of tight spaces. You could spend all day looking at different phobias, but that's where that word comes from. That's how we get the word phobia, is from this Greek word phobos. So it talks about this great fear swept the crowd. And I thought about that, and I can imagine that there was just this great sense of confusion, like, what is going on? What is this guy doing? And oftentimes when we encounter something of God, we're afraid, because many times it's something that we could never have thought could happen. We never would have even thought realistically could have happened. And that would have been what these people were going through too. This boy's dead. He's been dead for days, if not weeks. He's gone. Like there's no way that he can come back. He's gone. He's completely gone. And with a few words, Jesus raises him from the dead. And he does this because, as it said earlier, he has compassion on the woman, because he knows the importance of having a son, of having a husband to take care of her. That's just how things operated back then, and much different today, obviously. But he understood what was going to happen to this woman if he didn't, or if she didn't have anybody around. So he had this compassion. He had this sense of, okay, I am going to take care of her. I want her to be okay. I see the pain. I see the heartache. I know what's going to come down the road for her. So I'm going to do something about it. And he did. He raised this boy from the dead. And so the crowd starts saying, a mighty prophet has risen among us, and God has visited his people today. So they're starting to understand. They're starting to connect the dots. They may have heard stories about some other things that he had done, but this large crowd likely has been following him from place to place, kind of like Forrest Gump, if you will, but they've been following him from place to place, and they're seeing all these things happen. So they're really starting to connect the dots, to make the connections to just how special this guy really is. Even starting to talk about how, God has visited his people today. Whether or not they believed right then and there that Jesus was God, I don't know, but at least they understood the supernatural power that was present in Jesus that he had to have in order for him to be able to raise this young boy from the dead. And then it talks about how the news kept spreading. And I can imagine that it would, with something as big and significant as this, not only just raising somebody from the dead. He did that more often, or not more often, but he did that not just only once in the New Testament, but it's not an unusual thing for him to do, but it's also not common. But that he also, I think people would have understood the significance of this woman having her son back, and that he would be able to help, that he would be able to be there for her. I think that probably would have been maybe just as big of a part of the story as the fact that Jesus rose this boy from the dead. And so as the story spread, as the news of Jesus kept going around Judea, going around the known world at the time, his legend kind of grows. And he's I don't know if you could say he's on his way to becoming a rock star, because I don't know if those existed back then, but he's getting more and more famous. People are understanding more and more about him. Not quite to the point yet where if someone were to say Jesus, they would know exactly who he is, but there's these stories, and oftentimes they may start out as like urban legends, as well, did this really happen? I heard it from somebody who heard it from somebody who was there. They may not have had this direct experience with Jesus, but now more and more people are starting to have this direct exposure to him, and they're seeing it for themselves. And then they're going and telling other people about it, and in a way kind of preparing everybody, the world, to see him, to encounter God, to encounter Jesus. So what I want to leave you with today is this, that if you are struggling with something, if you are having a hard time, Jesus has compassion on you. He understands it. He wants to help, and he's always there. It doesn't matter what time of day, it doesn't matter what day, it doesn't matter where you are. He has compassion on you. He cares. But I also want you to know that there's nothing to be afraid of with God. The people in this passage had fear. They were afraid because they didn't understand. Well, we don't have to be afraid of God, of Jesus, because we have the whole story. We have it in here, right? Everything that we need to know about Jesus is in here. They wouldn't have had this. They didn't have the stories. They didn't have how it connected to the Old Testament. They didn't have any of that. But we are fortunate enough to have that. And so as we read the Bible, as we understand more about God, as we understand more about Jesus, we don't have anything to be afraid of. We should not be afraid of experiencing anything from God, of talking to Jesus, of anything related to our relationship with God, because God is compassionate. God cares for us. He's always there. So hopefully, I don't want you to be afraid. I don't want you to be fearful of God. I don't want you to be afraid of anything, because God is with you, because God is always there, and because God has compassion on you, and he loves you so much. He absolutely is crazy, bonkers, head over heels, madly in love with you. Let's pray. Father God, thanks for today and all that you have done. And I ask, God, that you would just be with us and help us to live our life in a way that we're not afraid to, but also, God, to know and to understand how much you love us, how much you care for us. Be with us in the coming week, and just thank you for all that you do for us. We love you so much. It's in your name we pray, Jesus. Amen. All right, guys, thank you. Have a great week, and we'll see you next week. Bye.